everyone, and welcome to the Arkansas Society of Freethinkers monthly meeting. We call this the big meeting. I am Bern, and I'm on the board of directors of the Arkansas Society of Freethinkers. ASF is a nonprofit organization devoted to the separation between religion and government. We advocate for science and humanism. We definitely want to improve the lives of non-believers in our community. We hope today's meeting is thought-provoking, interesting, and inspiring. We hope you'll find friends and potential friends here. You can learn more about ASF by picking up one of the flyers available at the welcome table or on the web at arfreethinkers.org. AR is in Arkansas, arfreethinkers.org, or the most reliable way is by getting to know the members and the organizers around you here today. First of all, a couple of housekeeping announcements. Restrooms are at the back of the room, just beyond that wall that is just beyond the kitchen. Standard disclaimer. The Arkansas Society of Freethinkers is a diverse organization. Our members have a wide range of opinions and beliefs. We invite speakers who we hope will give us food for thought. Our speakers do not always represent the official position of the organization, but we hope they will always spark interesting discussions. After the program, we hope you'll stay for a few minutes for coffee and conversation with our speakers and other free thinkers. Today, we will have a discussion with Dr. Sybil Jordan Hampton and Robin Woods Loucks. Are these correct? Good. I was impressed on me by a boss one time. Everyone at least deserved to have their name pronounced correctly. So there we go. Robin Woods, now Robin Loucks, was a junior when her high school, Central High School, was desegregated in 1957 under an international magnifying glass of anger, hope, and conflict. Her spontaneous act of kindness to one of the Little Rock Nine on his first day of school marked her for persecution at the hands of classmates and the community for the rest of the year. When Oprah Winfrey had the Nine on her TV show in 1996, Robin was the only white classmate the Nine could recall by name who had been kind to them. She has been honored nationally for her actions during the crisis. Sybil Jordan, now Dr. Sybil Jordan Hampton, was one of five black students enrolled at Central when Little Rock schools reopened in 1959. None of her classmates spoke to her for 3 years of high school. She was awarded the most and best college scholarships of any student in her graduating class. After college, she taught at-risk students in Chicago's schools, earned one of her master's degrees from the University of Chicago, and was the Dean of Liberal Arts at Iona College in New Rochelle, New York. Earned a master's degree and her PhD from Columbia University. She returned to Arkansas 30 years after high school to run the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. ASF President Orsi will guide the discussion with our guests, and hopefully we'll have time for questions. Ann, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Bern. And just to let everybody know, I adore both of these women. Getting ready for this discussion meant that I spent several hours with both of them hearing their stories. We're not going to cover even a tenth today of what they have to say. They are both so remarkable, and at any given point, I may break down in tears, so just warning you. So in the 1950s, Central High School, as everyone knows, was one of the very best schools in the United States. And I'm sure everyone in this room has heard of the Central High crisis and at least the bones of the story. So Little Rock schools were supposed to comply with the U.S. Supreme Court's order to integrate the schools racially nationwide, and of course, the Little Rock schools in Arkansas in general resisted. There was an extra lawsuit. The Supreme Court had to come back and say, no, guys, really, I mean it, integrate. And Governor Faubus in 1957 calls out the National Guard, first to maybe protect the children, but then no, it's to prevent them from getting through the doors of the school. So President Eisenhower federalized the Arkansas National Guard and then sent down the 181st Airborne to make sure that 9 kids could actually go to class. It's insane when we think about it now. in light of our sensibilities today. So as Bern said in the introduction, Robin Loucks was a junior at Central the day the Little Rock Nine finally made it into their classrooms. Robin, tell us what happened that day. Tell your story of that day.
That particular day, everybody was absolutely scared to death, black and white. And I went into my algebra class. I always sat at the front of the room because my sister had been valedictorian, and I was not the valedictorian, and I knew I was going to flunk. So I had to sit at the front of the room so that I wouldn't be distracted and I could pay attention and make not disgrace the family. But that particular day, and I was on time, I sat at the back of the room, and I have no idea why, but I just plopped myself down in a desk fairly close to the door. And the door opened, and you heard the click of the 101st Division heels as they ushered Terrence Roberts into the room. And I looked at him, and there was one desk about 3 feet over, and he kind of collapsed into it. And I looked at him, and I thought, this child is about as scared as I am. And the teacher required us to open the book to a particular page, and he didn't have a book. It had been stolen in a previous class. And so I waited an interminable time, it seemed, hours, for some of the stupid boys in the class to behave themselves, because this back in that time, the boys took care of the boys and the girls took care of the girls, and nobody moved. A little voice inside me said, "Get up, move your chair, and share your book." And so that's exactly what I did. And it made a scraping sound across the floor. And Terrence and I sat there, and we were both just terrified. I don't think we remember a single thing that happened that class. He knew that I was about to catch hell, and so did I. And that's exactly what happened. I was followed home from school that day. I had rocks thrown at me. I was spat on. And one thing I do remember, I did not turn around and look, but I got to my front door, and I turned around, and I just looked at them. And they didn't say a word. They turned around and left. Never cry, said my mother, when you're confronted with anything. Don't cry when you get a shot at the doctor's office. Don't cry. I learned that lesson that year.
That's a pretty powerful day at school. So Little Rock schools, after that year, once again, Arkansas filed suit to try to prevent the integration from continuing. And the schools were actually closed during the next school year, 1958 and 59. And during that school year, some more decisions were made, or during that lost year, as it's called, other decisions were made about integration, how it was going to happen. And instead of 9 students in the 1959, was it 1959, 1960? Yeah. There were 5 who were chosen to attend Central High. Sybil Jordan was one of the 5. She was a sophomore that year. Sybil, tell your story.
I was the youngest of the 5 students. Carlotta and Jeff had actually been able to begin on the first day of school. The school board was trying to hold to just having the Little Rock Nine be a part of the school desegregation. And as a result of further legal action by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, 3 other students, including me, entered school about 2 weeks later. The first day, there were National Guardsmen standing along the steps, and you know what that's like. And we drove up together and looked, but there was no one outside other than the guards, so that was a good sign. We went in, and everybody else was in class. We were coming in after the school day began, so everyone was in class. And the most wonderful thing is that Elizabeth Huckabee, whom some of you know, was there to greet us and to let us know that she was our point person, that if anything happened, she was there and that her arms were open for us. And she escorted each one of us to our homeroom. We went to my homeroom, and everyone in the class turned to see me come in, and they turned back. My homeroom teacher pointed my chair out to me, and that began the 3 years of my being with the same people every school day who never, ever acknowledged that I was a part of the class until it was my turn to read the Bible. And I would be informed that today was my day to read the Bible, and we would pledge allegiance to the flag.
So, why did you go to Central? What was it that made you decide that you wanted to be one of those 5 students, or inspired your parents to do that?
It was really a family decision. You know, people ask me all the time, how did your parents let you do that? And I go, au contraire. My family was very much involved in the NAACP. We attended, and I still attend, Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church. Ernie Green, Gloria Kalmar, Melba Patillo. 4 of the Little Rock 9 were there. Their parents were my parents' friends. And so we were actually part of a community of people in Little Rock who were thinking about what next. And these were families that were making the decision that someone's children needed to step up. But also those children needed to be children of families where there would not be retribution. My father worked for the post office. My parents had a grocery store. My mother was a substitute teacher in Little Rock, so that they really did have the option of supporting me and my brother who went the next year in going there. I think that we often forget that this all took place in the segregated South. And sometimes people have no idea what a family does to raise a child in the segregated South. And the parents of children at that time had to raise us so that we understood that we had to go to the back of the bus, that we understood never to drink at a water fountain that didn't say colored, that we understood from day one that you don't go into a restroom that is not a restroom for color. So that lifestyle is not a very humane lifestyle. And so people who live that lifestyle also have something else, and that is hopes and dreams. And what I learned in my church, from my family and my community, is that from the days of slavery, our foremothers and forefathers believed that the promises of democracy could be theirs. And as the people in Hebrews, they died in faith, not realizing that, but passing on the hope, the faith that someday that we would be able to, as a people, take part in all the wonderful things of society. So that as a child, that was very clearly what I was a part of, and that's why education was so important. Do well, press on, because you may be a part of the first generation of our people who have the opportunity to take part in higher education at the highest levels, are wonderful careers. And so that was really a driving force in my life, and it helped me to know, and my brother, that we really wanted to be a part of the struggle because we felt we were strong enough. And we lived on 7th and Park. We walked past Central every day on our way to Dunbar. And my brother and I used to tease and say to ourselves, that's our school, our parents pay taxes, it's our neighborhood school. And I always say to people, I didn't go to Central High School. People say, oh, you wanted to really be with people, white people. And I said, no, my brother and I felt that it was our school. We were claiming that. But also we knew that it was high ranking in the nation, and we were very good students, and we were interested in excellence. And that it was important for us to witness.
So that's another thing. You were high-ranking students, and deliberately the students who were chosen for integration were students who had done well academically and socially in the segregated schools. what about your family's educational background? You talk about your own, obviously, but your family was also educated.
Yes, I am just a proud child and grandchild of people who always valued education. My mother was raised by her father, who, as a single parent, my father was raised by his mother as a single parent. My father grew up in the Delta of Arkansas, but my grandfather went to college in Mississippi before the turn of the century. He would hitchhike down after the planting season, and he was not able to stay because of family concerns for a 4-year degree, but he earned a 2-year degree at Alcorn State. My father grew up in Wilmar, Arkansas, and they did not have a Rosenwald school there, and therefore he did not have the credits that he would need to go to Philander Smith College, which was his dream. So my father hitchhiked to Little Rock, and he was one of those men who did not have a family to live with in order to go to Dunbar High School, and so he lived near where the Heights Theater is, and he as a servant in order to go back to school. And so I have that wonderful legacy of people who really valued education and made sacrifices. So my mother and father both are Philander Smith graduates, and then my mother got her master's at the University of Arkansas Fayetteville when they opened to bringing teachers from Little Rock for summer studies.
Robin, your family also valued education. Talk a little bit about your experiences with education and meeting people of diverse backgrounds when you were.
I would love
Yeah.
to. My mother grew up in the Delta and in Pine Bluff. They had a plantation in the Delta, and which they lost ultimately. But that's irregardless of this. Mother, first of all, went to a one-room schoolhouse. She had stories of riding her pony to the schoolhouse. And then there becomes a time in your one-room schoolhouse education that you can no longer learn anything more. So my grandmother homeschooled her for a number of years where she learned Latin and French and all the other things that you're supposed to take in high school. And she went ultimately back to Pine Bluff and graduated when she was 16. She was then taken on the grand tour. And as a matter of fact, one of her grandmother was too.
My great-grandmother and your grandmother went on their world tour together. Yeah, to Europe.
I've known her.
Our families have only been friends for 4 generations.
Mother and my grandmother were sitting in the train station in Paris. They were occupying a table for 2, and it was a table for 4. And along comes a very elegantly dressed black couple who inquired if they could share the table with them. And my grandmother said, well, of course. And they sat down, and they had pleasant conversation. And my mother looked at this couple, and she thought to herself, and it was a revolutionary idea to her. She looked at them. They were more elegantly dressed. They were better educated, better spoken. And she said to herself, I'm a country girl from the Delta South, and I will never look at anybody's color, the skin color, in the same way again. And it changed her life, and it changed my life and my sister's life. When I was about 5, right after World War II ended, my father was shipped off to Nanking for 2 years. So she decided, with military travel, she would take us to Peru. And so we lived in Peru. We lived in Lima for 2 years. And she took us all over the whole area, back into the back end of Brazil, back up into the mountains, to villages in the middle of nowhere. We went to a private school. She taught us to walk from the house that we were living in several blocks to take a public bus, to take the public bus through Lima, get off at the Francisco Pizarro Park, walk through the park to school, and return in the afternoon by ourselves. She would have been 6 or 7, and I would have been 4 or 5. We had a lovely time. When it was chilly, we sat at the back of the bus. That, if you could get a seat, that's where it was warm. We were both very, very blonde. And in Lima at that time, and even now, You can count on maybe several dozen hands the number of colors of skin. It was an international crowd then and now. And it was, as far as I was concerned, it didn't make any difference. The people over here would comb my hair, pet my hair because they had never seen a blonde. So what? So what? It was part of the daily travel. And so we come back to Little Rock, and all of a sudden, fast forward a few years, and the wintertime would come along, and I would be going down to the public library, and I would move to the back of the bus because that was warm. And I was forcibly told that I couldn't sit at the front of the bus. And I couldn't sit at the front. I mean, at the back. I had to sit at the front where people were supposed to sit. And I asked my mother about that, and she explained segregation to me, and she said it wasn't fair, but that was the mores of the South at that time. All of which struck me as being vastly unfair. And so I just continued to be a child and grew up. I had always been taught, and Mother was not particularly a churchgoer, but there are certain things that you do. You are never rude to anybody else. You do unto others as you have them do unto you. The golden rule. It was something we were never allowed to use language that disparaged another person. Black, white, Chinese, whatever. It was just not an option. And also, Mother was working very hard. She was divorced. And she would not let us come home to be latchkey children. And so she hired a lady, Mrs. Hester Pearl Young, who became one of my mentors. She taught me how to cook. She taught me how to iron. She told me to pick up my toys. And what she said went. She would have family problems. My mother would come home, and they would put their heads together and solve the problems. When my mother and I just remember this, when she would get a Christmas bonus, she split it down the middle with Pearl because we both needed the money. They both needed the money. And so when Central High School came along, how in the world, when Terrence came in, could I ignore him? How could I do that to another human being? When I loved Pearl, I loved what she represented. We are all equal. We are all equal. That's what I learned.
So you acknowledged and were offended by the disparity that races were treated with. And Sybil, you obviously were aware of it all. There was a lynching that took place at your church, right? In 1927, I think. And were you frightened about the prospect of going to Central at all?
Actually, not at all. I wasn't really aware of what life would be like. I mean, who knew what was going to happen when the schools opened again? But my parents had always taught us that life is not fair, that things can be dangerous, but that you have to have courage and you have to just approach things openly and respond to what happens rather than making up something in your head and going in with apprehension. So that I was perhaps certainly curious, and I was very still and quiet because I just didn't know. I mean, there is a state of mind that is, I'm about to do something and I just don't know. And so I am just moving forward.
Did you get the sense that you were being bullied or that people hated you?
That's something that over the years it's been very fascinating for me to reflect on, because when people talk to me, they say, oh, when people hate you, they treat you, the way you were treated. And I think, I'm not sure how many people hated me. What I do know is that I didn't matter, and I think that's different. The manner in which I was treated was I did not matter. Because I think that if people had really hated me, I would have been assaulted. I would have been, you know, but people ignored me. I did not matter. And I do believe, because I think what Robin said is really very important, what you learn about the way in which you see and the way you are in the world, you learn at your mother's breast. You learn it before you really even have an opportunity to know what you're learning. And so your attitude about what matters comes very much from the experiences you have, I think, from the beginnings of your life. And that was even more shocking. It's one thing to be hated and to have people dynamically interacting with you because they want to resist you, but it's another thing to learn that you don't matter. And there were two instances in which I learned that, and they were not frightening, but they were certainly chilling. Even though people didn't talk to me, I played on sports teams in gym. And everybody just did what they had to do. I mean, because I think schools were orderly then, and we were all very disciplined. We did what we were told to do. And I had fallen on the concrete and playing basketball and had a bandaged knee. I was in the hallway, and a guy with a leather jacket on, big guy, I knew he was a football player, came up and just kicked me as hard as he could on my knee. And my knee started to bleed. And what was striking to me was that nobody stopped. Nobody offered me any assistance because my leg really hurt. And I got myself to the office and got taken care of. Our parents couldn't come to the school under any circumstances, so my only recourse was to go to Miss Huckabee. But the most stunning thing that happened was Central, you know, is very tall. And if I had class on the highest level, and I used to walk up the steps every day, and there would be this kid in this class that I had been told was the educably mentally handicapped, it was called at that time. And he always leaned out the door and leered at me every day. And I just grew accustomed to it. But one day, it turns out he had been collecting saliva in his mouth the entire period. And as I came to the top of the staircase, he leaned into my face and just spat. And my face was dripping wet. I was at the top of the staircase at the highest level of the building, and I had to take myself all the way down to get to the office. And I was mortified that no one reached out to me. It was as if nothing happened. I mean, people didn't say, oh, look what happened to her. It was that people just ignored me. And I learned from that you have to have presence of mind and keep your wits about you. That there are things that happen that don't trigger in other people the kind of feelings that they would want for themselves or they would want for their children. And that's when I understood, as I thought about this over the lifetime, what is so insidious about what has happened in this society is that it becomes very difficult for people to stand up to be counted for someone unless you think they matter.
Robin, you were there when there were 9 kids who had a whole lot of attention focused on them, and you were one of the ones who was getting followed home from school and spat on too. What was your experience as far as other students like you who supported the integration effort?
We didn't have a group of students who got together to support integration because we were scattered throughout the 10th, the 11th, and the 12th grades. Most of my friends lived in Pulaski Heights, and they went to the new school, Hall High, which had been built by the powers that be in order for the real people to avoid having to integrate, to put it pretty bluntly, the forerunners of white flight. We lived in the old section of town where I still live because my mother didn't have time to carpool. She was told when she built her house that she needed to build it in a better section of town. She refused because we had to go to and walk to grade school, junior high, and high. And so basically I didn't have very many close friends at Central. So I was alone. And I had very few interactions with my classmates because I was a different person. I had the thumbtacks put in my chair. In one of the school assemblies, somebody, as we were standing up and sitting back down, somebody moved my seat so that I sat down on it wrong and cracked my coccyx, which was pretty painful. But looking back at how Sybil's parents taught her, my mother was a very fierce and independent woman, and we were living in Falls Church during the war, and at the tail end of the war, the LRCHS survivors were freed, and there were newsreels, and some of those newsreels are still available, and I'm sure many of you have seen them. My mother took us to the movie theater, and she said, I was 4 and my sister was 6, as these flickering images crossed of these pitiful people staggering out, she said, remember this. You have got to remember this. You must make sure that this never happens again. And what she was teaching us was that we are all in this together. You've got to take care and love your neighbor.
So your mom, was kind of an icon in Little Rock print circles. She was the food editor at the Gazette, right?
Yes.
And she wrote about politics in the food columns, right?
My mother was a splendid writer, and she was stuck with being the food editor, and she loved food, and she was very good at it. But the idea of writing about food interminably drove her crazy. So she wrote essays every week, and she had a good many male memberships. And somehow, during the course of the essays, she would twist it around and talk about food. But she was very adamant about prayer in the public schools, and she was very adamant about integration. And the Gazette allowed her to print her columns, and I got to find them. I have them all somewhere, but I've got to go back and find them, because when she was writing, I wasn't reading those.
That's okay. You internalized them anyway.
I did.
So did you have a support system at all for, other than your mother, obviously, and well, your sister had already graduated by that time.
My sister had graduated and was off at Bryn Mawr, but I had Pearl to come home to every afternoon.
What other kind of support system did you have? Did you like go to your mom's office?
I went to the Gazette office almost every afternoon and did my homework, because that's where it was fun.
Well, did they talk to you about what was going on at school that day?
I knew most of the reporters who were there, and there was one reporter who was, she wasn't Danish, she was Norwegian, I think. I can't remember. But she was there, and Mother brought her to dinner, and she said, would it be possible for you to get some of the moderate students, we were the moderates, and some of the integrationists, or the integrationists would have been blacks, you know, and the segregationists together, and let's talk. And so I did. And I got 2 of the black students and 2 of the ardent segregationists, who's Sammy Dean Parker was one, and 2 of us. There was a fellow named Joe Fox and me. And all of this was taped, and over the course of several hours, we convinced the segregationists that this was about education. It was not about integration. It was not about intermarriage. And they were all excited, and we decided we would try to get the school to have the same discussion in front of the whole student body, which didn't fly at all. And I was a member of the student council and tried to talk to the administration and to the student council about doing this. And no, absolutely not. And I would leave the school to go out and talk to the reporters to tell them what was happening. And finally, the boys' vice principal, Mr. Powell, came out, took me by the arm, and said very firmly, you will come in, you will not come out ever again, and if you do, you will be expelled. And those were back in the days where we behaved. We followed the rules. And I knew he meant it, and I knew that I could not be expelled.
So he was telling you to stop talking about having a conversation.
He was telling me to stop being active.
Don't be an activist.
Ooh.
Yeah, that wouldn't fly. Sybil, what kind of support did you have?
In the school, the only support that I had, other than the other four students, was in the cafeteria because the people who were the cooks were people who went to my church or were family friends, and so it was really a lovely thing to have lunch and to see friendly faces and to get an extra cookie or this and that. All kinds of, it was very wonderful, very, very small ways in which people showed support. Outside, I had always been engaged with Girl Scouts, Y Teens, my church, and all of that continued. That part of my life was not disrupted in any way, and so that I had an incredible amount of support. But the most important support I had is that I didn't talk about going to Central High School with anybody. It was the most fascinating thing, and that had been true with the Little Rock Nine. They may have been going around the country talking and being featured in the newspaper, but at church and in all the things that we did not talk about that. And there was just this unspoken agreement that you would let people's lives go on as normally as possible, and that you wouldn't spend your time sort of like being like a dog with a bone revisiting what happened, because there was not very much to say except the same thing over and over again.
I wanted to say something about the food at Central High School. They had absolutely the best knockdown, great big dinner rolls I have ever had.
Yeah. I don't know where to go with that. When you left Central, now Robin, you were your junior year, so you never graduated from high school, right?
No, I'm a lost soul. Uh, I had always taken extra classes during summer because, again, my sister was a valedictorian and was off earning honors at Bryn Mawr, and here was me. Here I was staggering along. So when the schools closed that year, I'd always taken everything, and the only class I needed to graduate was senior English. And so I took the SAT and was accepted into, actually I was accepted into Bryn Mawr, but I knew I couldn't go there. So I went to Euler, or then LRU, and after 6 months, I couldn't handle it. I was not right. I was a basket case. So off, I left Arkansas, never to return.
Well, obviously you're sitting here now. So you returned, but why do you say you were a basket case? What had happened during that year?
Yes, it took me until 1992 to figure out, and thanks to the Oprah Winfrey Show, I figured out that I had a really monumental case of post-traumatic stress. And what you do when you do that, you draw a little box around yourself and build a wall and try to cope.
So what happened with Oprah Winfrey? How did that
I love
come
her.
about?
I came home, and there was a message on the answering machine that said, if this is the Robin Woods who went to Central High School, would you please call the Oprah Winfrey Show? And I thought, you've got to be kidding. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll try this. So I picked it up and called, and they answered, and they said, do you remember the name Terrence Roberts? And I said, yes. And they said, well, what do you remember? And I said, I remember that I shared my algebra book with him. And they said, well, that's what he says. We've had a hard time finding you. Can we fly you up here this next Monday or Tuesday for a special show we're having? And I said, yes. And so they flew me up and made me up, did my hair, all the nice things that you think you're going to be a television star, and that's what they do. And so, I mean, it's true, everybody. All of the guests who are going to appear on any TV show get made up. Well, anyway, I was a surprise guest. I don't know how they found me, but I think it was through the White House because we lived right across the street from the governor's mansion. And so I was a surprise guest, and I was able to not fall over the cables, which I almost did, and walk up and sit on the dais with all the other real people.
So you were on the show with the Little Rock Nine when
Yes.
Oprah had them
Mhm.
on. And there were other white students who were at that show too. Were you sitting with them or were you sitting?
I was sitting on the center table, center dais, because the others were there to apologize.
And they did apologize?
They did apologize.
But they wanted you as the one white student who
They
was
could
nice to them.
And there were others. There's Joe Fox, who some of you may know, and I think he is ill right now. But he used to go to Trinity, where we used to go. But he remembered being kind, particularly in science classes. But he was the I'll show you. The thing that we had meeting with the integrationist, the segregationist, and the 2 of the 9 was you published. This is part of it, and it was also recorded and broadcast on NBC, but it was blacked out in Arkansas. Of course.
That book's out of print. When you showed it to me the other day, I went to try to find it on Amazon and I could get it for $1,000. So, yeah, next time you invite me over to your house, hide that. So, Sybil, well, Robin, you did finish your college education.
I did. It took me 2 tries as I was growing up, and I finally ended up with 2 degrees and a master's.
And Sybil, in the introduction, we read out at least half of the degrees that you have. What was your college experience? You got an amazing award of all these scholarships, right? I mean, it was even published in the newspaper that you had this amazing cache of scholarships, and you also were invited to go to Bryn Mawr, right?
I went to Earlham College. I went to a Quaker college. My parents were very concerned about where I would go after Central. They knew that I had been wounded, and they wanted me to be in a place that would be a healing community. And some of you may remember that the American Friends Service Committee sent a team that stayed in Little Rock over a year. And they met at Camp Aldersgate because that was the only safe place in town for people across, the races to meet. And I ended up going to Earlham College, which is in Richmond, Indiana. And I didn't know that the Ku Klux Klan was revived in that area in the 60s. And so as we were driving to the college, there were these huge billboards that were speaking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., being engaged with communists. But Earlham was a wonderful campus of about 1,000 students. It was one of those places that lots of university faculty sent their children to. And so it was an oasis in truly a desert. But when I arrived, there were 3 African-American women on campus that year. And my parents had told me when I went to Central, this is just a rehearsal. As you move, if you have the opportunity to do things outside of Arkansas in life, you're going to find yourself being the only one of a few, in a place where people haven't interacted with people like you over and over again. And so that was one of the things about Earlham. But of course, the difference between Earlham and being at Little Rock Central High School is that the college made a commitment to be a community, a learning community. And so everything about our being there was designed for young people to interact. People couldn't have cars because there were lots of wealthy kids there, and they didn't want that to be a factor. And so that the campus really was a place that leveled. The most striking thing is just before we went to campus, we got a handbook. My parents were reading the handbook, and thank God for reading parents. And in it, it said that if there was only one Negro girl in the class, she would not have a roommate. She would live alone. And my parents called to say that I wasn't coming. Well, it turns out that that president who made that rule had been the president of Fisk University prior to going, which is a historically black university. It is incredible that a person who had been the president of Fisk, a Quaker, would then come to Earlham, and there would be the rule that would, if you couldn't have a Negro roommate, you would have no roommate. But that rule had just been changed when I went. And that helped you also to see that this person who had lived and had been really an effective president of Fisk went to Earlham, and the concern was about what? Not the Negro students. It was concerned about the other students and their parents and their concern that they didn't want their child to have an other roommate.
Wow. So was Earlham a sundown town?
Earlham was not a sundown town, but it was one of those towns on the border. A lot of people came up from Kentucky. We could not go to the movie theater and sit on the lower level. And so the college would rent the movie theater on certain occasions so that we could go and see movies and all sit together. There were places in town where you could not go in the front door. I was copy editor of the student newspaper, and it was typeset, and the town that it was typeset in had just been a sundown town until a couple of years before. And so it was my beginning. It was the beginning of my understanding that there's down south and up south, and that, the country is a country that has problems, and they're just manifested in very different ways. Indiana had miscegenation laws in the 60s, so that really and truly, I think sometimes those of us who have lived here in Little Rock carry a larger burden. I mean, I'm not saying we don't have a burden, but carry a larger burden in feeling that things were worse here. I think things are just different. And also, we had the privilege of, in an era when TV was new, of being the thing that was a part of the beginning of broadcast TV becoming what it is now. You are there.
So were you an object of curiosity at school? Did they consider you an object of curiosity? You were this black student who had come to this up south? Or...
Oh, no. Earlham had always had, Richmond, Indiana was on the Underground Railroad, was a part of the Underground Railroad. So that it was not a town in which there were not African Americans. I wasn't considered to be an oddity. I was really considered to be one of the crowd. I mean, it was the healing experience that my parents wanted me to have. It was actually a wonderful, wonderful place. And of course, there were people there who had not had the opportunity to be with students who were not like them, but people came to Earlham looking to be a part of something that was having to do with being international. We had Japan studies. The year I graduated, Earlham had the largest number of students, undergraduates, going into the Peace Corps. So you can really tell what kind of campus environment that was.
So you left Earlham, went to Chicago, right? And you were teaching in Chicago public schools?
I taught for 1 year in a school in Chicago that had a policeman full time, which was a pretty scary thing.
They call those resource officers now.
Yeah, well, a teacher had been murdered in the book room, and there was a high school on the same property, and it was in the West, and it was a very difficult neighborhood. And it was the experience that I had teaching there was difficult because the other teachers who were primarily African American did not accept me. And so I would say that my life story has been moving from Central and then moving on with my life and finding myself in places where people would say to me, "You're not really black."
Why would you not really be?
I had gone to the University of Chicago, and I was teaching in a school in which not a lot of people would have been able to get into the University of Chicago. And so although I was a very, laid back, kind person, people had already labeled me when they knew I was coming from the University of Chicago. And so by the end of the year, the principal said to me that he thought that that my manner was not easy enough for kids, and that he thought that I had an edge, and that I should probably not teach. And so I didn't have my contract renewed. I And I did not want to work with teenagers, as you can imagine, after having gone to Central. I swore that I would never encounter teenagers under circumstances in my life again. And then I ended up, as a result of not being able to continue being an elementary school teacher, getting involved in higher ed. And I discovered that all the things that I experienced at Central High School made me the perfect person to be a dean and to be an academic advisor, because what I knew is that the turmoil of growing up and going away from your family offers you a wonderful opportunity to examine your values, and that you need to encounter people who challenge you to think about what you're saying. When I was at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as a dean, one of my students came in one day and he said, "Those red niggers." It was about spearfishing. Spearfishing in Wisconsin is a very serious issue, because only the American Indians are allowed to spearfish. And the Anglos hate that very, very much. And so here's one of my students who's carrying on, and I said to him, "Halt. I know you're comfortable with me, and so you have no idea that what you're saying is offensive to me." I said, "I have been called the N-word millions of times, and I am not going to participate in anybody else being in that class." And he turned white. He was just startled. And sometimes I think people believe that you're so eager to be a part of the larger world that it's okay for you to join in the conversation where somebody else gets tarred and feathered. And that has been a part of my experience, because my experience in all of my collegiate experiences were in predominantly white institutions. And it was really challenging, because in each one of the experiences, people were not expecting me. And at Iona College in New Rochelle, New York, there are people who went to the president of the college to say, "What is that colored girl doing, making decisions about the academic progress of my student?" I would say to you, if I had not gone to Central, as painful as that was, and really learned how to keep my wits about me, but also learned that people did not know enough to be kind and thoughtful and accepting of someone who was me, and that I needed to be a part of the journey for many people of getting to a better place.
You know, you are one of the most zen people I have ever met. You radiate. And you're so edgy. But yeah, you have this calm personality. You really, I mean, you bring calmness into a room when you enter it. And I've only known a few people who do that just by the sheer force of their presence, bring calmness to the area around them. And I wonder from that if that calmness maybe didn't help you get through the emotional trauma of what you did experience for 3 years of high school being ignored.
I would say that I grew up in a wonderful family. My mother, my father, my grandfather. And what they were realists. And my mother would say, "When you leave this house, you may not encounter anybody else today who loves you like we love you." She said, "But remember that our love is like a little coal in your heart. And sometimes, it looks like the fire's gone out and it's ashy. But," she said, "you go blow, 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 and that you can revive that. And that's where you turn." And I learned that as a small child, because my parents were concerned about my going out into a segregated world. There's no way I could have been trained to do whatever that would have helped me to go to Central. Because the way in which those decisions were made, the timing was that you can't train somebody for that. You know, it is your life's training. It is your family love. It's all of those kinds of things that prepare you for the unexpected opportunity to be a change agent and a foot soldier.
So you eventually came back to Arkansas, and you were not in education when you came back to Arkansas. How did coming back to Arkansas come about?
I never planned to come back.
And do you blame her?
But the reason I didn't plan to come back is that I saw that the people who were doing well were African American men. And so I felt that as a woman who really wanted to have a high-flying career, Arkansas was not going to be the place. And so that's why I never expected to come back. I had the opportunity when I was living in New York to become a contributions manager at the GTE Corporate Foundation in Stamford, Connecticut. And that happened, once again, because of my network. Somebody just threw my name out. And it was true here. They had been searching for a president at WRF for some months. Malin Martin, who was my friend, died in September of 1995. And in July of 1996, somebody called me at my office saying, somebody gave me your number and said that we should talk to you about WRF. Well, my husband, who is here, who is wonderful, had just made a big move from Wisconsin after 18 years to Austin, Texas, and I knew he was not hardly likely as a Philadelphia guy wanting to move to Little Rock, Arkansas. And so the search consultant said, I need to talk to you in the next couple of days. And I said, sorry, won't be able to do that. We're about to go on vacation. I thought, this is the end of that. And she said, where are you going? I said, oh, we're on our way to Madison. She said, oh, we have a house in the Apostle Islands, and we're driving through Madison.
They were determined to get you.
And she said, and so we'll find a hotel that will allow us to get a room and talk. And we spent an afternoon talking, and she said, they don't even know that you're the person they're looking for. And it's going to be difficult because you've been away for 30 years. And the other difficulty was that I was a woman.
Not that you were black, but that you were a woman.
That's right. That's right. And you know, I learned this. I don't talk about race very much because the things that have happened to me very often are because of gender. And some of the things that happen to me are because people don't like smart people. You know, and I'm not bragging about myself, but I am a person who quests for excellence. And lots of people are not comfortable with people who can think for themselves, you know, who are thoughtful, kind, whatever. But coming back was a real challenge because for me as a woman with a husband, with a career move like that, that was an incredible decision to make. And I love my husband. He's here today, and he gave me the most incredible vote of confidence, and our marriage lasted. But coming back was very fascinating because I had never worked here, and that's very important in Little Rock. I was a stranger, and there were all kinds of people going, who is she? And I went lots of places where people, I would go to meetings, and I might be the only woman coming to the meeting, and I would open the door, and someone would come to the door. This happened to me 3 times, and say, can we help you find where you're supposed to be? I love saying, I'm with you. But it was the honor of my life, but also my parents were still alive. And what was really important for them is that the very thing that they always told me and my brother, you do not know where the journey of life is going to take you. You do not know how many doors are going to open to you, that you do not know that you may be the first generation of African Americans to achieve at the highest levels of society. And for all the pain that my parents held on to watching both of their children go to Little Rock Central High School and graduate in 1962 and 1963, they were elated that I became the president of the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. And they said, it's the best job in Arkansas. I said, of course, it is. And so they had the real joy of sharing that with me But the other real joy my parents had is after 20 years, I was invited to the first reunion at Loucks Central High School with my class.
After 20 years, you were finally invited to a reunion.
Carlotta and Jefferson Thomas were not invited until the 50th year. And Jeff died within the month before that. And therein lies a story, once again, of how things hold on. If Ron Hughes, who was in my homeroom and never spoke to me a day in my life, had not gone to Vietnam, come back to Chicago and gone to Roosevelt University, where he read The Invisible Man in class. And he said, we made Sybil Jordan invisible. And I am going to do whatever I can over my life, when I can, to do something about that. And Ron, at the 20th year, said to the class, I should be invited. And I was invited. And I lived in New York, and I asked my parents to join me because they had never been able to come into the school. The only time they were at the school was at my graduation, which was ringed by. When we arrived at the dinner, Ron was at the door, and he said, no one else in class feels comfortable sitting with you, Sybil.
Even 20 years later.
20 years later.
1982.
1982. And therefore, we are going to sit, but I'm going to be with you. Ron is an incredible example of the power of one, the power of one, because he, the greasy greens, Ron is just this cool, hip guy. He was really a very popular guy in our class. During the course of the evening, so many people came to talk to me because Ron made it possible for them to do it. And I even got invited to the sock hop at the end. And of course, you know that Ron was going to dance with me. And other people did it. And it was really, and one of the other classmates took a class picture with me there. But it really was a wonderful experience for me because I thought I needed to know after all those years whether or not people would still harden their hearts and treat me as if I didn't matter. I actually got an award at that reunion as most educated. At the 50th reunion, we were at Chenal Country Club. There must have been 200 people there. I was there alone. My husband doesn't do those things. And Ron was on program doing something. And one of the classmates had been up talking about how much love there was in the class of 62. And it was going on. And I always just kind of gird my loins, keep smiling. And I thought, Well, when Ron finished his presentation, he said, I need to say something, class. I need to say something. I need to correct something that we're doing here this evening. He said, there's one member of our class in this room who did not experience that love. And he said, we have to acknowledge that Sybil was not a part of any of the good things that we were talking about. And I want to tell you, and particularly young people, sometimes you got to live long enough. But then the other thing is you've got to be open to the experience of going back in your life and being in contact with people because you get messages. And the message I got is that over time, people did remember, and people have apologized to me at our 75th birthday party. Recently, a guy who's a minister came up to me and said, I sat in homeroom and I watched you and never asked myself, what is she suffering? She's always alone. Nobody ever talks to her. He said, I am coming today to ask your forgiveness because I want to go to my grandchildren and tell my grandchildren about this day and about me and how long it has taken me to come to you to admit that I failed you as a person. So that's what's important to me, is to be able to say that, that was a difficult time in my life, but it produced so much beauty in my life. It produced so much strength in my life and also so much love.
Robin, does your class have reunions?
I want to say that Sybil is one of the most remarkable human beings I have ever known. And it is my blessing to know you.
Agreed.
That's when I start crying.
Robin, does your class have reunions?
No,
You would have graduated during the lost year.
I didn't have a class. There have been a few combination reunions between Hall and Central, but they had a year. But I haven't heard or been invited to anything for, Harry, how long? 15, 20 years?
So does your class, when they do get together, even though it's been 15 or 20 years, do they talk about the integration experience?
Well, I always did, because there would show up a few people who understood what had happened. So we all band together, a tribe of three.
Tribe of three. Boy, it strikes me that when Robin's experience was, I went to Memphis to the Civil Rights Museum a few months ago, and I'm going to start crying here in a second. One of the exhibits that really stopped me in my tracks was the burned out shell of that bus, the Freedom Riders bus. And what strikes me is that the black students who went, the Little Rock Nine, they were the ones who were on that bus. They were the ones who knew there was danger, went anyway, and their bus got firebombed. Sybil, though, was one of the people who got on the next bus. How amazing is that? That you get on the next bus and you keep going. I want to thank both of you for being here today, and thank you. I thank both of you for being here today, and I know that there may be some questions in the audience. We've kind of gone for a long time, but if anyone has questions, I want to be able to open it up for questions. Thank you.
I think that Sybil's background is completely envious. I would have liked to have grown up with your parents. But
you did stand out. I think it's amazing that you did stand out. That from the beginning and suffered some consequences, because I can't imagine what these young people endured during those high school years.
it was incredible. I do have to say that my mother was enormously supportive of what I had done. And at one point she said, well, I would have disinherited her if she hadn't.
I think Robin and I are perfect to be here together today because I think we have so much in common. And one of the things we have in common is that we came from phenomenal families. We had wonderful, families. And that we really, in our lives, have reflected the values that we were taught.
Which are the values that are saddening unavailable today. They're there, we're just not using them.
Someone will come with a mic.
All right, thank you both for sharing. I have two questions. You can choose to address both of them or one of them, whichever. The first one of the things that stuck out to me about your story, Ms. Loucks, is the worldly experience that you had as a child. And one of the things I've run into a lot in my life is that when you find people who have exceptional empathy and you dig into their stories, you tend to find that I lived here, I lived there, I had this experience there, and then you're in the place to show the empathy at the right time. And rather than being a person who sits, you do. With that in mind, what do you all think about, I don't know how to ask this question, but how important do you think it is that people like me, parents of small children, find ways to get our children those experiences early in their lives? What impact beyond being in the right seat at the right time did that have on you, on your growing up? And then the other question that I had was for both of you, in that lost year, how did education happen in Little Rock? I'm sure that, we had private schools for some people, but there were black children, there were poor white children who couldn't afford it. So how did education happen during the lost year for Little Rock students?
Who should go first? Let me talk about travel. I think it is as soon as you can get your kids out of Arkansas to go on vacation, go anywhere. Go to New York. My mother had some acting experience when she was, I guess, in her 20s and 30s, and she had a number of black actor friends. And one of the things that after that dreadful year, she sent me to New York, and I did summer stock, and it was a many-hued cast. Some were friends of hers from years and years and years before. It was wonderful. So I had been in New York when I was 2 and 3 years old. I was taken to Broadway shows when I was that age. We did the same thing when we lived in Peru. And so any broadening experience is just imperative to broaden your kids. Take them to the Caribbean. Let them see what a third world is like. I've done a number of church mission trips to Haiti. You have never seen a third world. Yeah, I guess you have if you've been to many other parts of the world. Travel is probably one of the most important things you can do for your kids.
Reading. I dreamed a world because I read. You may not always be able to travel places, but reading takes you many, many places. And I think that too many of our children don't read richly and read things that are they're wonderful children's books that really reflect on other cultures, other parts of the world, so that reading is another way of broadening and building, understanding.
And read to your children. My mother read to both of us from the time we couldn't talk. But she would read not only the children's books, she would also read the classics, like Kipling, wonderful, incredible stories that Disney ruined by putting them into cartoon.
So the lost year, what?
Briefly, because there's some other question. People went to school in the county, Wrightsville, Sweet Home, people went to live with other people around the state. People went to live with relatives around the country, and a whole bunch of people never finished high school, white and black.
Thank you for sharing your experiences here. I have a couple simple questions. Looks like it doesn't work. It is working fine? Well, one of the questions is related with something that I heard from Sybil, that is that she was acknowledged when she has to read the Bible. So my question is, that practice is just gathering historical facts. That practice obviously is not here anymore at Central or any school. You know where that ended? That's one question. And the other one is, in general, you as a representative of two ethnic groups, at that time, notice any other ethnic groups, like, I don't know, Hindus or Hispanic or whatever, and when Central started noticing that and how they reacted to it?
What strikes me is that I remember, because I used to walk in front of the school every day going to Dunbar, that there used to be Asian American students there. And they were Japanese American students. It was Richard Yada and his brother and others, people who stayed here after the internment during World War II. So, and I think that those students were not there when I went. I think those students left the school and went to other schools, and because there were no Asian American students at Central when I was there, but there had been Japanese American students there. Oh, the Bible. I'm not sure when that was taken out. of, but it may have been in the 70s.
We'll have another speaker come talk about that because his mother filed the lawsuit and he now lives in Magnolia, Arkansas. So we'll have him come talk about that. But I believe it was I think the case was filed in 1962. It may have been decided a year or two after that. Thank you. We have a judge in the crowd. Thank you. Do you remember the year? Right, right. And the case that Vashti McCollum filed was actually not filed in Arkansas, although her son is now a professor at the college in Magnolia. SAU, thank you. I was drawing a blank. Yeah. Another question?
Yes, I have a question. First, I want to thank both of you for sharing experiences. So often, we may get a speaker to share their experience, but to have both, it's truly been an opportunity. So I thank you both. And your stories, both of you, your stories resonated with me for many reasons. But one of the things that I want to ask you, and you can answer certainly in an integrated fashion, once we hear their stories, once we know better, we are to do better. And I'm all about forging ahead, reclaiming our common humanity. And it's been a very difficult thing, even at this time in our history. But how did your early experiences, academic, education, professionally, help you now in your adult life to have integrated social relationships? I've met informed people, Black, white, Asian, and others. But since I've been here in Little Rock, one of the most challenging things is getting people to transcend barriers or boundaries and socialize and have authentic relationships. So I want to know from you two. I have an idea from Sybil, but I want her to share it. Going through that, through Central, going through the professional world, returning, being a woman in a male-dominating field, being exposed internationally, what are your relationships like now? How do you encourage people at this juncture, after hearing your story, to go back and to extend fellowship, socializing, getting to know our neighbors? We turn to the left and right and say hello, and then we're out the door. But I'm all about cultivating, reclaiming our common humanity. And that's something I'm very passionate about. And it's been the most challenging aspect of my journey, and maybe that's what I'm supposed to do.
Would you like to come to dinner?
Would I like what?
Robin gives great dinner parties. Accept her invitation.
And what we try to do is have a variety of people, some of whom have nothing in common, and yet we all end up having a hell of a lot of fun. Is that true?
Risk-taking is really tough. And it doesn't get any easier as we get older. And I belong to the Aesthetic Club of Little Rock. And I have tried to invite friends who are African American, and people are just reluctant. Well, in the Aesthetic Club, you have to present papers. And so it can be terrifying to anyone. But I think that what we really come up against is that people don't trust that they matter enough. People believe that a lot of things that have to do with getting to know people who are different, they're superficial and not really heartfelt. But I think things are not heartfelt because things of the heart require us to have trust and enough interaction that we can really discover what it is that would bring us together. We live separate and apart. I mean, people work together It's just amazing. I mean, I tell people the real conundrum for me is that people work with all kinds of people. People go to lunch and then people go home. And it is that thing about going home that people, a woman said to me, but we have to be friends with the people that we're most comfortable with. And I think, yes, we have to be friends with the people we are most comfortable with. But how do we in this society grow to be most comfortable with people who are not like us, but who actually may be like us? Because the superficial decision about who is based on color of skin and ethnic origin, religion, because I hear people speaking about the fact that they don't have anything in common with people who are Jewish. But I mean, there are all of these things that we have as isms that are barriers to our coming together. But I found in Little Rock that being a part of the Aesthetic Club, I'm on the board of Mount Holly, and there are people who say to me, but it's a Confederate cemetery. And I go, it is not a Confederate cemetery. I mean, but you know, to really be able to like help people to understand that what their first impression of something may not be what's really true. But I think that having a conversation like this, having people in the room who are diverse, who may not come here all the time, and really that we have to do more of these kinds of things. Because it's through these kinds of things that people start to have, I think, the types of informal conversations that may lead us to decide to do something else together. Your church, Highland Valley United Methodist Church, is certainly on the journey. You know, a predominantly Anglo church that is now has an African American pastor, and Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church and Trinity Cathedral have a covenant relationship, and I have been involved in leading Bible studies the last 3 years on Thursday evenings with a group of like-minded people. And we are coming to trust, but we're not a large group. But it doesn't take a large group. We each are going to be those little coals, you know, and we each are going to be able to spread fire. But this is a million-year journey, friends. The kinds of things that have created what we have in Northern Ireland, Catholics and the Protestants. This is the stuff that is at the heart of us being born in sin, frankly. But it is the kind of stuff that is so hard to eradicate because it's emotional. It's not intellectual. And it takes courage, it takes passion, it takes commitment to say that you're going to go on the journey to forge relationships, to be a boundary spanner, and to do it in whatever way you can do it. And if each one of us did some small things, what a wonderful world we would live in. It's not big things, it's in very small things that the difference is going to be made that will make this world the kind of world where if somebody kicks me, someone else will say, someone who's like me hurts. If we could really identify that the hurts of the other are our hurts, and if all the hands that reach could touch,